You're listening to the Dennis Prager show, and I have Professor Thomas Madden, professor of history, the new at St. Louis University, the new concise history of the Crusades. My second question about the Crusades, and this is a terrific learning session for me and my listeners. There's no question. This is such an important subject that's raised all the time, as I said, and people don't know much about it. If all of those areas that the Christian Crusaders went to re-Christianize had originally been Christian, why do the Crusaders have the name as being the aggressors when it seems like there is, if one is to make a moral assessment, both sides are equally at fault?
Yeah, I think that's largely because we tend to, well, in the modern world, we tend to look at Europe or the West as being the active, powerful agent in the world, and all other cultures as being someone who is acted upon. But it's important to remember that in the Middle Ages, Europe was really the third world. It was backward, poor, internally broken down and fractious. The real superpower of the medieval world was the Islamic kingdoms, these enormous empires in the Middle East that controlled most of the Mediterranean. And in that respect, then, if we look at it from the medieval perspective, these are not the Crusades are not offensive actions, nor were they ever understood that way in the West. They were always seen, even the First Crusade was seen as an immediate response to an aggression from the Muslim side. As I mentioned before, the First Crusade was actually called because Muslim armies had swept through Asia Minor, Christian Asia Minor, in 1071. And the emperor in Constantinople was out of options. And so he asked really the last people left in the Christian world to help him out. And the Pope in Europe then called this crusade as a kind of a last-ditch effort to try to begin to push back these Muslim conquests.
So had the Muslim empires not extended to what we now know as Turkey, there would not have been a crusade?
It's hard to say. Probably there would have been something like it in any case, because Christian armies were fighting Muslims in Spain even before the First Crusade was called. But something of this magnitude, where you had really large armies that were organizing, it took something really big, like the fall of Asia Minor, to bring that about.
When you say Asia Minor, you mean Turkey?
Yeah, that's right. What's today Turkey? If in fact that had never happened,
what had never happened?
If Asia Minor had never fallen, then we'd be in a whole set of different circumstances. The Muslim empires would have had to, therefore, have been weaker, and they wouldn't have constituted the same kind of threat that they did.
So the Crusades are perceived as for the liberation, so to speak, from a Christian standpoint, of Jerusalem and the holy areas, but in fact it's really about the spread of Islam more toward Europe through Turkey.
Right. There's really two elements to crusading when it first begins. The first is to be an act of Christian charity. That's the way the Crusaders saw what they were doing. That they were undergoing enormous expense and a risk of life to go thousands of miles from home to help other Christians who had recently been conquered and were under the control of Muslim empires. That was the chief aim of the First Crusade. The secondary goal of the First Crusade was that if that could be done, then they could press onward even to the Holy Land to restore those lands back to Christian control. And those two ideas were intertwined throughout the centuries of crusading. The concept that you're not only going there to right a wrong, to push back an aggression, but when that initial aggression began, it could have been last year or it could have been 400 or 500 years before.
Then is it fair to even characterize the Crusades as entirely a religious crusade?
Yes, I think so, because they are religious enterprises. I mean, they're wars, of course, which means they're brutal and reason that Crusaders took the cross, the reason that they took a vow to make a journey like this, was inherently religious in nature. It was because people in the Middle Ages cared deeply about where they were going after their death, because death was always very, very close in the Middle Ages. People died for no good reason. A plague swept through and you were dead. And so people thought deeply about where they were going after they died. And the crusade was particularly useful way for fighting men, people who made their livings doing things that would get them into hell, to turn that around and actually use their swords for a good and charitable act, one that could actually be for the salvation of their soul.
Wow, that's a fascinating take. You describe the medieval mentality as being different from ours. Is that an example?
Yeah, that's one. I mean, nothing focuses the mind better than mortality.
Right.
When you if someone discovers that they have only a short time to live, they see the whole world differently.
Yep.
And in the medieval world, because nature and everything around it seemed much more capricious, people didn't understand why you got sick or why you died, and it was therefore assumed that these things had something to do with God or magic or of some sort. But what was crucial was to keep in mind always what was going to happen to you after you died, and because that could be tomorrow. And the Crusades were one aspect of that. It was a way for these warriors to do this. Now, of course, average people did different things. They didn't go around killing people either, generally, but they could go on small pilgrimages or.
But when the Pope called for the First Crusade, what was his declared purpose?
Well, we don't know precisely. There are several different versions of his speech that he gave, but most historians accept that the initial thing that he asked for was to go and save the Christians in Asia Minor.
That's why I said, I asked a question that may have seemed almost silly. When I asked you, is it entirely religious in nature? Saving a fellow member of your religion is not entirely a religious act. Americans want to save Americans, and British want to save British, and that's not religious. Saving a member of your group is not the same thing as liberating holy lands or where you'll go after you die, which I thought was a very fascinating insight. You see what I'm saying? It wasn't to liberate Church X or Church Y. It was to save Christian X and Christian Y.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so hold on. We'll be back in a moment. Professor Thomas Madden and the new concise history of the Crusades. I'm Dennis Prager. You're listening to the Dennis Prager Show. We're learning about the Crusades from Professor Thomas Madden and his new book, The New Concise History of the Crusades, published by a scholarly press, Rowman and Littlefield, but it's not. But it's written for the public. It's not written in university-esque. The First Crusade is 1095 to 1099, and it is primarily to save other Christians who are being overrun by Muslim armies in what is now Turkey. But they also decide at the same time, since they're on their way to the Mediterranean, to liberate Jerusalem, which had been under Muslim control for 400 years. Is that a fair summary?
Yep, that's right.
Okay.